Good morning, everyone. My time is it's 1 minute to 9, and I think maybe we should wait for 2 minutes and we'll start.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, again. It's now 1 minute after 9. I think we should start. My name is Zota Khatewe. I'm going to be the program director for this roundtable themed African perspective on indigenizing research ethics. This is the 6th research roundtable discussion with the Vice Principal of Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization, titled ASIKHULUME. ASIKHULUME means let's engage or let's talk. I would like to believe that it is not a mistake that this series are titled in isiZulu, one of the indigenous languages of South Africa. ASIKHULUME in this instance has an exclamation mark to signify two things. The first one, it is an urgent command. And the second one, it is a complete sentence. It would seem to me that Professor Meyiwa is commanding us to center African knowledges because they exist, hence the exclamation mark. By using an African language, she is also communicating that Africans do have knowledge and this does not need to be debated. That is why ASIKHULUME, it is a complete sentence. In this sense, she wants us to demystify the myth of emptiness and discovery, where Africa was understood as literally and figuratively empty, which meant Africa was not recognized as having people with knowledges. To demystify this myth, Professor Meyiwa has invited renowned scholars who will share with us these African knowledges and show how they are applicable and relevant today. This is very exciting for me, and I hope everyone who is here is very excited. But before I get carried away, I need to make sure that all protocol is observed. We need to open this session officially. So I would like to invite the Vice Principal of Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization here at UNISA, Professor Meyiwa, the queen of the show. Over to you, Professor Meyiwa. Professor Meyiwa.
Okay. Should I be going now? I think I was on a wrong platform. Good morning, everyone. Can I check with the program director, Dr. Khatewe? Am I audible?
Yes, Prof, you are. And we can also see you.
Yes. Thank you so much for that. I was obviously on a wrong platform. I'm just realizing that I was asked to rejoin again. That as it may be, what a morning we have. It's a morning that's calling us to engage, to actually reflect, step back a bit, and say, under this series that we have, that we started in 2011, let's talk. ASIKHULUME is a Ngoni expression which says we've got to talk. And of course, as a oral society, Africa is still very much an oral society. Much as we engage in this kind of fashion as we do, but a lot of what we have to do gets to happen through us sitting down, stopping, stepping back, and reflecting. When we started this series, which are actually in the sixth now that we're having, it was under circumstances that were very difficult, wherein we haven't been very much used to talking face to face at most, shaking each other's hands, hugging as we often do and always, that we had a sense that we needed to continue this culture, this tradition that we have, but with a sense of how do we do it differently, considering the context we're in. And with that said, Jambo, Sanbonan, Dumelang, Puemore, Absheng, Molweni, across the seas, and now we're being joined by people from various platforms, from YouTube, Facebook, through some LinkedIn, Teams, some from the phones, some in the comfort of our homes, some in our offices. And we're continuing this tradition, but we're saying we want to do it in this fashion because moving with the times. As we move with the times, we want also to be saying we want to be looking at how we maintain who we are, what we are about, and what we seek to promote. And it is through these kinds of conversations, this kind of koluma, as we see, we continue to do this morning for the next 2 hours under the theme that we've entitled African Perspective on Indigenizing Research Ethics. And for me as a research manager, I want to welcome everyone, starting off with the colleagues, Professor Chilisa and Professor Masoha, who are part of the panel when we will be deliberating and actually saying, what's this about really? As researchers, as local people, as people who want significantly to bring about change. And the deliberations we're having this morning, being led by Dr. Nompumelele Khadebe, our Chief of Programming this session, is to try to look at how do we do things in a manner that affirms who we are. Amongst the scholars, I want to cite a recent paper done by Kondo and others, acknowledging the significant relationship between indigenous knowledge systems, the arts and culture, the heritage, the identity, holding the view that, open quotes, recognition of indigenous knowledge systems within the research context will serve a number of purposes: building self-esteem, identity, the dignity within communities, which is actually a core focus of what I think we shall be sharing this morning and engaging you towards the end of this session in terms of how do we do things differently from a local context and from appreciating people that are joining this session from across the seas and looking at what it is that's putting us together and making us to want to appreciate who we are, what we are about, and to take somebody has got to mute, please. Thank you. In doing that, I am actually of the view that with what we've had to contend with as the world, we are in a time that I personally refer to as a challenge toxic season. All seasons come and go, but this seems to be staying for quite a long time. We know about the war that's happening. It's affected a number of people around the world, much more than others, than the developing world, of course, and the underdeveloped being the most affected. Coming closer home, we're looking at just this week, in this first hour, if we were to look from the office point of view, we've had news about, of course, dating from the previous week, what's happening within a political space. One of the news pieces that saddened my heart relates to the fact that much as Statistics South Africa has made reference to 35% unemployment rate that we have now, the 35% relates to those that are actively seeking employment, not those that have actually given up hope. Of that number, the youth sector, so says Statistics South Africa, has doubled there. So it's actually almost double, 64% plus, which is a concern. But much as it is a concern, what does this mean for us from a research ethics point of view, from a local contextualizing of us wanting to look to find solutions for the problems that may at surface global view affecting a number of people, but what does that mean for us and how do we document, question, look at the human rights, look at the socio-economic development, and look at our identities, learn from our heritages across the board, not just only to be saying we've got to replace one for another, but my wish is that we check on how could we be learning from all forms of knowledges to bring on board, democratize the knowledges towards ensuring that they become as a unison without losing who we are, without forgoing our heritages and our arts, our systems as we've always known them, but say localizing the indigeneity of the knowledges for knowledge production. We have a lot to put on the table and hold our hands and say we can do this. We can actually solve a number of challenges that we learn about on a daily basis, a number of which is one that I've made reference. So it is my hope, Program Director, that we shall make sure that we are responding to these to a certain degree. This is the beginning of a conversation. It is a conversation of ASIKHULUME indeed. Let's continue talking. Let's continue to kuluma. And it is in the kuluma as a culture which is very much oral based, as I hold, that will find solutions that will begin and continue to respond to the concerns that we actually have. Being in the last 8 years of the Sustainable Development Goals, we have a lot of responses, solutions, driven concerns to be looking at. And with that said, I am certain that the conversation we're having this morning shall be a conversation that will take us a leap further from where we've been. Thank you. Yabonga, Jambo, Asante.
Thank you so much, Professor Meyiwa. We hear you. You have welcomed us and we feel very welcomed, and you have given us a context to this conversation. So we are not going to waste any time. We are going to start with the conversation. Before we start, can I request everyone to mute their mic and switch off their cameras? To the panelists, please note that you all have 10 minutes each to present. We know that sometimes it is difficult to keep up with the time when presenting. So Thando is going to assist us. When you are left with 2 minutes, so she will switch off. She will switch on her video camera with a black card that will show the remaining time. To the audience, if you have questions and comments, please write them down. At the end of all the presentations, we will open the session for discussion. We will try and read the comments and questions on the chat while allowing those who will want to speak to speak. Our first presenter is Professor Chilisa. Professor Chilisa is a head of the Postgraduate Research and Evaluation Program at the University of Botswana. She has conducted professional development workshops on indigenous research methodologies and contextually and culturally relevant evaluation around the world. Her book, Indigenous Research Methodologies, is used in many universities across the globe. She has over 80 publications and has received over 30 million pula in grants to conduct and design interventions to address gender inequalities and to mitigate the impact of HIV/AIDS on the quality of life of people in Botswana and beyond. Over to you, Professor Chilisa.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, ASIKHULUME. It's an honor for me to be joining you on this valuable and very, very important discussion in which we try to dialogue about the problems in Africa, especially as it relates to research. My topic is on indigenizing research ethics, and I talk about indigenizing research ethics from the perspective of looking at worldviews. My starting point is that paradigms, which are worldviews, they make us see what we see, and we cannot see beyond the paradigm that we use. So a paradigm is like our eyeglasses. Some will allow you to see far because you are short-sighted, and some of them, of course, will allow you to see near because you are long-sighted. So my starting point is that indigenizing research ethics in Africa is about problematizing the current paradigms that we have. The starting point is that the current paradigms, research paradigms, namely post-positivism, interpretivism, the transformative paradigm, and the pragmatist paradigm, they are informed by the histories and cultures and traditions of the Euro-Western societies, and that these cultures and histories are not inclusive of our own histories and our own cultures. So we start off with assuming that we can have a paradigm that is indigenous to Africa. And so when we do so, we look at our African philosophies and our cultures. And in Africa, the philosophy of Ubuntu and other philosophies that emphasize relationships are better placed to inform us on how we can conduct research that is respectful of the indigenous ways of knowing of our people. So I have talked about a post-colonial indigenous paradigm as a paradigm that is informed by the ways of knowing and the ways of perceiving reality and the value systems of African people. And I've used Ubuntu as the main philosophy that can inform us how we can look at how we do research. And so when we do so, the first question that you ask yourself when you are doing research is, are the theories and ideologies that inform how you do research respectful of African people? And when we start at that point, we are basically looking at ideologies that look down upon African people. We are looking at deficit theories about Africa that see Africa as a lesser continent, as a dark continent, as a people that needs help. So when you do research, are you doing research from the perspective of Africans who cannot contribute anything? Are you doing research from a perspective that sees indigenous knowledge as not science? Indigenous knowledge is science, just as indigenous knowledge in Euro-Western societies has been science that has informed the civilization and all the development in Euro-Western societies. So here we are trying to bring in indigenous knowledge systems and saying this indigenous knowledge system should inform how we see the world. And when we do so, we therefore walk into the research process with questions like, are we going to accommodate spirituality? Because Ubuntu is about, it talks a lot about the connection between the living and the non-living. And it talks about the interdependency of people. We are people that are related, and therefore relationships play a very, very important part in how we see the world and how we should relate to each other. So when we talk relationship, when we talk Ubuntu, we now bring in 4 aspects that are very important to indigenizing research ethics. We are talking of relationship, we are talking about
Professor Chilisa? Professor Chilisa? I think Professor Chilisa is having some technical problems. Can we bring her back? Professor Chilisa? Okay. I don't know what is happening with Professor Chilisa. So I'm not sure what should we do? Because she was in the middle of her very interesting presentation. She was still...
Dr. Radebe, it would be an immense loss if she cannot finish her presentation, because I was listening in awe on this side.
Yes.
But maybe let's give her a few minutes. And I'm not sure if it would work. Maybe we can answer one or two questions while we are waiting, because it would not really work for us to continue and then let her come back and present. My sense would be that it's better to connect now with what she presented.
Good idea, Dr. Fisari.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Fisari. So while we are waiting for Professor Chilisa to come back, and I can hear someone is also saying there is a network interruption. They were also disconnected and came back. So I don't know if we have a technical person who can look at that. Yes, I'm not sure if there is anyone who has a comment based on what Professor Chilisa had just said. It was a very interesting. For me, what was coming out clearly was the fact that as Africans, we do have knowledges and we do have our own ways of doing, of producing knowledge. And also what was coming out from Professor Chilisa was that what we understand as science, the Western science, it also emanates from a particular culture. So it's not just universal, but it is located somewhere. So that's what I was really getting from Professor Chilisa. I'm not sure if we have a question or someone who would like to make a comment.
Madam Program Director, I would like to ask something. I attended a Canadian conference on indigenizing on Friday evening, and the focus was very much also on the unborn children. And my question is, in terms of Ubuntu, I know that it is a very spiritual way of looking at the world. What is the role of unborn children within Ubuntu?
Professor Fisari, this is not my presentation. I don't want to answer because I'm not sure what Professor Chilisa was advancing with Ubuntu. But before I open up for someone who
I can chip in. I'm back.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much,
Yes,
Professor.
yes.
Thank you. Yes. I'm not sure if you did hear the question that Dr. Fisari was asking. So maybe while you are presenting, I'm not sure if your presentation will talk to that as well.
Oh, I thought I was just answering the question.
No, Prof. Chilisa, we wouldn't want to miss your presentation. So you're welcome to continue with your presentation, and then I would really be grateful if you can answer my question, but you can continue with your presentation.
Yes, now I was talking about 4 principles, the 4 R's of relationships, building relationships with the communities, so that the communities can feel part and parcel of the research, and that their knowledge system can also be included, and the R of reciprocity, that is giving back to communities. Most of the time, we do what we call helicopter research, where we go into the community, we collect our data, and then we are off. So doing research ethically in the perspective, from an African perspective, it means building long-lasting relationships, so that even after the research is conducted and is done, you still have a responsibility to continue the dialogue with the communities and to have projects that are not only short-term but are sustainable, and they go on for a long time, and they are continued. So I've always thought of how can we do research that is respectful and sustainable and therefore ethical, by ensuring that we continue the research. is not something that you start today and stop, but it's something that you build on and it continues, and that those that come after you can also pick from where you left, and you continue to do it. So that is a reciprocity, and it is about giving back to the community. Then there is rights and representation. Most of the time, South Africa, for example, they have a very good program on IKS where they expect professionals, academics to work with indigenous knowledge holders to do research. But you see, the thing is, there's a lot of what I may call unethical dealings there, because sometimes the knowledge holders, they give the knowledge, and then once the knowledge, the scientists, the academics, once they get the knowledge, they take it and own it. And if like they were looking at an indigenous plant with an indigenous name, they change the name, and the indigenous plant is lost, its name is lost, and the community that gave the indigenous plant is also lost, and in the end, the community does not get anything. So how can we do ethical research in such that the communities also benefit from the research that we do? How can we do research in such a way that even the indigenous holders, if they gave the knowledge, they also become part of that discovery that the scientists have discovered, and they also get recognized in the big journals, and that they get to be known. I always say, for example, that as the Deputy Vice Chancellor researcher was saying, we are an oral society. For example, right now, Ubuntu is not credited to anybody, but I am therefore I am, which is by a French philosopher, René Descartes. It's credited to him. But because it's credited to him, it goes on and on and on. And we can never talk about how do we, what happens to the unborn child. Will the unborn child know I am, therefore I am, the individualistic aspect of life? So I'm now answering the question because I think I've taken all of my time, and I'm saying that talking about an unborn child and Ubuntu, I don't see the problem there. The Ubuntu is a philosophy that is about humanity. Who is the unborn child who will not love to know about humanity? That you have to respect your environment, and that your environment is not there to be abused, but you have to live harmoniously with your environment. I think Ubuntu is already teaching the globe, the whole world, how important it is to address climate change now by actually bringing in Ubuntu, because Ubuntu has always, and African people have always respected the environment, and that without respect for the environment, we cannot go very far. So for the unborn child, the aspect that is obvious and that cannot be denied, spirituality is one aspect. When we say spirituality, we are only emphasizing the fact that we want to respect the environment. If you don't want to respect the environment by having a totem, it's still fine, but you have to know that, because respecting the environment by having a totem is spiritual, but you can also respect the environment from an Ubuntu perspective without necessarily practicing spirituality. So Ubuntu is humanity, is humanness. It does not conflict with democracy. It's another aspect of democracy that goes beyond Western democracy to say it is a democracy from an African aspect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, you have really educated us. I can't wait for the conversation later on, but we are going to move to our next presenter, Professor Masoha. Professor Masoha is a Dean of Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Zululand. His research in African Indigenous research and decoloniality follows 5 years of research and teaching experience. He has developed Afro-sensed approaches and frames for conducting research in and with local communities. He is the book series editor of the series publication Knowledge Pathing, Multi, Inter, and Transdisciplining in Social Sciences, published by OASIS. Over to you, Professor Masoha.
Chairperson, thank you very much for this opportunity. The title of my presentation, as it appears on the program, is an Afro-Science Perspective on Indigenizing Research Ethics. And I have to confess right from the onset that some of what I will be saying actually could merge with what Professor Chiliza said. Suffice it to say that I've always said that research and knowledge production can no longer be conducted with indigenous communities as if their views do not count or their lives and personal experiences, including the experiences of the research process, are of no significance. So it's actually high time that when we talk about ethics, that we need to deeply think about the communities that we have been engaging for over the years. We're talking about people who are now PhD holders and who are claiming to be experts, and without actually according any acknowledgement to the communities that they actually worked with in this process. And I think there are quite a number of few things that I would like us to ponder at. One is the ways in which academic and research institutions are addressing local needs and concerns. I know this was partly touched by Professor Chiliza when she spoke about, are we giving birth to our communities? What is it that we're giving birth? And she spoke about repositories in this case. And then also number 2 is how participatory research responds to different language and communication styles. And I think partly that was also covered in terms of oral or orality in this case. And of course, also affirming the point, which is number 3, orality as a human-centered way of communication, which must be considered, I think, when we deal with indigenizing research ethics and approaches in this regard. The 4th one is the questions about ownership and control of knowledge. This part has not been covered, I must say, Chairperson, in terms of saying who owns this knowledge. Because what happens is that you have all these ethical boards of universities meeting and finalizing proposals. And at the end of the day, that knowledge goes back to the university and it sits somewhere in a library, and people start now parading as experts in terms of the knowledge that actually comes from this university, from these communities. And the 5th point is about ethical and methodological dilemmas that we constantly encounter as we do research. And the 6th point, and these are the pondering points that I've actually mentioned, it's about promoting indigenous approaches and participatory research methods in this case. I wanted to delve into the issue about reviewing our institutional review of research protocols. It is actually worrying because you seldom hear of these communities, including our community representatives. It's about Professor so-and-so, Dr. so-and-so, who is knowledgeable in terms of that. And therefore, our communities are used as laboratories, and at the end of the day, once the research is done, the matter is closed and left there where it is. And I wanted to share a story. I think it was back in 2004 in a community which is about 25 miles from Pretoria here in South Africa. When I had to be challenged by a community because I went into that community and I was challenged in many ways. One was that before they actually gave me access into the community, they also told me very clearly that, look, you still have to come back and show us exactly what you have researched on and what your findings are all about. And of course, it actually meant that I had to simplify the language I used in my research work. And I found that to be very interesting. And in a number of my publications, I talk about researching back. And it's a very important point in terms of how many of us still go back to the communities where we conducted research, and then we still go there and account to those communities and engage with them in terms of what we have discovered in our research processes. In this case, we hardly do that. And something that I also encountered was that the community took me on in terms of the things that I thought were findings. So I was undressed, and this I've addressed it elsewhere in one of my articles. I was undressed because I believe that any scholar or researcher who engages in indigenized research should actually allow himself or herself to be undressed, to learn and unlearn and relearn a number of things that actually come from the communities, and we learn together with these communities in this case. So you have to be undressed and redressed by the research community, and hardly some of us actually find this to be easy to do. So I've used this, Chairperson, that the term researching back, it integrates all the participatory projects. Researching back refers to the discussions on our process, often centering on feedback and reactions from community members who are also part of the research team. These discussions are a regular part of debriefings as we gather data integral to the data analysis and interpretation, and fundamental to ensuring that we have open and honest communication with our community partners in this case. So therefore, this process has become an important term as it reminds us that this is a fundamental aspect of research, not an added or optional component. Further, consistent with that is that I have learned from engagement with these communities. The process often cannot move forward until they've been revisited in a cycling back fashion. So it is also important to learn from what we are doing and to expand our reflections over time and across projects. Conducting research in communities provides us with a chance to learn and to unlearn. We grow and we become better scholars when we enter into spaces of research with open minds and hearts when engaging with local communities. Therefore, it is my position that research cannot be seen as people with answers and solutions. Although answers and solutions are often what are sought, local communities offer spaces where more authentic solutions and indigenous knowledge can be blended with new knowledge in this case. And therefore, there are a few things that I think are very important to consider. One is that it is essential for researchers to balance their sensitivity to local indigenous culture by applying ethical participatory research principles and methodologies, avoiding causing harm, and that can violate people's rights and dignity. So it's important before one enters into communities to think about, and I think this part was captured by what Professor Chiliza spoke about, respect. And I think I would add to another R there, Professor Chiliza, about respect, which is quite important. So protecting the dignity and rights of people requires the use of non-oppressive research methods that promote a culture of respect for local indigenous communities' distinctive values, culture, and social practices in this case. Therefore, our communities matter in this case, and the language, the worldviews of our communities matter in this case. So it really behooves any scholar who moves into communities to start really thinking deeply about these communities. And I think we have this clashing or heavily engaging communities of a university community that I think most of our students that we promote are thinking about what are the requirements do I fulfill, have I complied with what the university actually wants, without thinking about the communities where you'll be conducting research. And in this case, in most cases, you get some of the students who are moving into these communities who are very disrespectful, because at the end of the day, what matters is what the university wants in this case. So this needs to be challenged going forward. And Chair, also in the interest of time, I would like to say that one thing that I have proposed, and I think this can be found in the work that I've done with Shokani and Blitz. We have really worked on this based on the data that we have collected and our engagement with communities in South Africa and also in Malawi in terms of Afrosensing. And this is quite different from Afrocentric. I have departed from the Afrocentric approach deliberately so, and I don't want to spend a lot of time debating it here, because I've also engaged with Professor Molefi Asante in terms of my deviation from the understanding of what this. Now, for me, the process of Afrosense does not exclude scientific epistemology, but seeks to blend ways of knowing and disseminating knowledge. It also accommodates other knowledge perspectives outside Africa, as long as they make sense to an African scholar. Afrosensing is not an event that happens once for all at a given time and place, but an ongoing process of seeing others and ourselves clearly in the process of doing that. Researchers in local indigenous knowledge should disseminate results to research stakeholders, including participants and communities, in a timely and competent manner so that they can build upon what was discovered. Afrosense epistemology, in my view, works for the base of an African worldview as a foundation for understanding African people. African beliefs, values, traditions should be observed when conducting research with local communities. There are 5 concerns I conclude. The first one that I want to raise is academic and research institutions should address concerns of our communities, language and communication styles, orality, and the questions of ownership and control. And the last part I need to include here are the forces in dealing with indigenized research ethics in this case. One is about contract, consultative participation, collaborative participation, collegiate participation. And in this case, I'm looking at the university and community. This is an ongoing journey. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Professor Masoha. I don't even know what to say. I am so inspired right now. You know, the part of seeing the people that we are doing research on, for me, it's really amazing, because we have a history where people were not seen, you know. So when we do research, we really do need to see people. We are not going to take questions. I see that Figile had raised her hand. As I indicated earlier on, that we'll take questions after all the presenters. So we are not going to take your hand, Figile. We will take your hand. You will be the first one when we open the session for discussion. We are going to move to our third presenter, Dr. Fisachi. Dr. Fisachi is a manager in research integrity at UNISA. She is the 2018 recipient of the DST Sarima Award for Professional Excellence in Research Management. Since 2019, she has been advocating for universities to implement harmonized indigenous-centered research ethics policies and practices. She fulfills numerous leadership positions, both locally and internationally. She is a non-executive director and the chairperson of the Ethispect Board of Directors. Rita is also a founding member and a co-chair of the Executive Committee of the Sarema Northern Region's Community of Practice for Research Ethics and Integrity. Her research niche area focuses on research ethics and integrity scholarship, and she remains active as a research supervisor. She is a co-auditor of a book on social sciences research ethics in Africa. Over to you, Dr. Fisachi.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I also want to acknowledge that time is a gift, and I want to thank Prof Meyiwa, our VP Research Innovation, Postgraduate Studies and Commercialization, for allowing me this opportunity to be part of this very prestigious event, and also to be able to stand on the shoulders of Indigenous scholars that are very esteemed, Prof Chalisa and Prof Masoha. I am building what I'm doing on their work, and it is for me an immense honor to be in their presence today. Also in the presence of Prof Meyiwa, that is actively driving Africanization and indigenization of knowledge within UNISA. In terms of my own self-location, I am a non-Indigenous child from Africa, but I am an ally advocating for research ethics governance systems and practices that are relational, holistic, interconnected, and reflexive. And as the program director said, I started this journey probably very early on in my career. However, I only formally engaged in this agenda around 2018, 2019, when we were revising the UNISA policy on research ethics, and it became very clear that we need to consider indigenizing our governance practices within the university. I believe that Africa and African ethics cannot be simplified. It is a million things compressed into a vast geopolitical entity, and therefore I'm also not claiming to speak for all researchers, all communities, all research integrity managers and administrators, but at the center of research ethics governance are actually key stakeholder groups. And as Prof Chalisa as well as Prof Masoha said, indigenizing is in essence a relational process. And I have experienced that there are often tensions in these relationships between the key stakeholder groups, specifically between researchers and research ethics review committees when researchers are doing work in Indigenous communities. Prof Masoha also lamented the fact that many of these decisions are taken without the Indigenous knowledge holders being present or a representative of a community being present. Ora Bator wrote very beautifully that Africa is not one thing. It is a million things compressed into a vast geopolitical entity. As such, Africa lends itself to a multiplicity of meanings, interpretations, and controversies. This dimension of cultural, political, social, geographical, and religious diversity should inform how we understand ethics and the moral questions confronting ethicists and lay people alike in Africa. And I'm sharing this quote with you because I know that there are diverse ways of looking at codes of conduct also in the research community. As many of you would know, the SAN code was formulated in 2016 as the first Southern African Indigenous Code, but I am aware that not all researchers and research administrators would actually agree that we can take the SAN code and as it is, just apply it to all community settings. Ramos, a South African philosopher and also one of our fellow Unisons, argues the very idea of the university, if seen as a site where only one version of what constitutes knowledge is promulgated, denies the value of other ways of knowing, such as those which address the material realities of life in Africa, and contradicts the ethical foundations of African society. So Ramose is clearly saying that it is important for us to consider African ways of being, as both the previous presenters also concurred with, but that it doesn't necessarily mean we must throw out knowledge systems that could add meaning to what we do within the context of research. Research ethics governance or oversight is vital in promoting a university's moral obligation to serve society. And there has been extensive debate that acknowledges the need to indigenize research ethics governance within the spaces of universities and research ethics committees. However, there's a tendency of RECs to actually continue to adopt the Euro-Western codes of ethics to guide their decision making. And what I also find intriguing is the fact that researchers, even if they do research within Indigenous communities, often just accept these codes of conduct without questioning these codes of conduct and basically then imposing Euro-Western codes of ethics without critically questioning these practices and asking themselves how it can be localized to make sense within those community settings. From a philosophical standpoint, universities clearly then recognize the strategic goal of fighting existing hegemonic knowledge systems and advocating for epistemic justice, as Chalisa also confirmed in her 2020 work. But there is a scarcity of information on how to transition from philosophy to practice. And when we engage in these conversations in the Directorate, our Executive Director, Prof Lesla Beskagni, also questioned how are we going to put philosophy in practice. And the work that I've embarked on recently aimed extensively to move away from philosophy to practice, but to stand firmly on philosophy, because we cannot indigenize without understanding your lenses, as Prof Chalisa also indicated. I asked then in the research that I recently conducted, how can African universities dominated by Euro-Western research ethics traditions promote an integrative Indigenous governance approach? And the integrative Indigenous governance approach is also from the work done by Prof Chalisa, and it is now confirmed by Prof Masoha that he actually also supports this approach. And I'm going to talk a bit more about what it means. But first, I want to just clarify what I mean with research ethics governance. So research ethics governance then in simplistic terms refers to how we administer or manage the oversight of scientific research, specifically focusing then on the ethical aspects, but also on promoting the integrity and the rigor of science, and what we put in place on an institutional level to protect participants and researchers, and also communities, the environment, but ultimately it is also about mutual accountability. All these stakeholders should be mutually accountable to promote good research ethics governance practices. Within an Afro-global research ethics perspective, I would argue that the concept Afro-global refers to the integration of African beliefs, customs, values, and social life systems as an intrinsic part of research, while remaining mindful of globally accepted research ethics frameworks. And this description has also been incorporated in the revised UNISA policy on research ethics, and it was born out of consultation with Indigenous scholars. What would an integrative Indigenous governance approach then mean? In essence, then, as Chalisa said in a 2017 publication, it focuses on the integration of Indigenous and Western knowledge systems, but with due consideration for the unique characteristics of local context. Indigenous knowledge refers to knowledge held by the local people in their respective areas, and this knowledge instills belonging and connectedness, according to Shakani and Masoha in their 2021 work. And the foundational values include that we need to connect knowledge systems in a way that it makes sense for the local community. And if I apply Chalisa's work, then it would also mean that we need to connect researchers, REC members and community members, but we also need to connect people and ecological systems, as Prof Chalisa referred to previously. The point here is not that epistemology should not feed one another, as Ramosi argues, but the point is one of justice. Epistemologies must speak with one another on an equal level, but not on the basis of superior and inferior. And this takes me back to the helicopter research, where researchers from the global north, for instance, might conduct research on communities within the global south, and where the knowledge system of the global north in the context of that research might actually supersede the local knowledges, and where there might be very limited benefit, not only for the communities, but also for the local researchers engaging in that research projects. From the research that I did, I developed an Afro-Global Research Ethics Governance Framework with outer dimensions that are key in terms of making moral and ethical decisions. But in the middle, or at the heart of this, is transformative whole system change model, and I want to focus on that model specifically today. And the model refers to an acronym, REAL, and what it means is that within the center, we need to question our current research ethics governance practices, and we need to be advocates to allow for reconnecting. So the R stands for reconnecting, and we have to ask ourselves then, when we are developing research ethics application forms, for instance, guidelines, principles, are we critical in terms of the processes that we develop, specifically in terms of how these processes allow for researchers to self-locate themselves? When researchers are doing research within community settings and working with indigenous communities, how do they position themselves? Are we allowing for sharing circles and dialogue? What is happening in the space of research ethics review, specifically in terms of the researchers and the research ethics committees? Are we actively providing researchers as RECs with an ethics of care and applying Ubuntu principles also in those relationships? And I am summarizing this extensively. In terms of the E, it stands for encouraging the disruption of the uncritical adoption of Euro-Western codes of conduct. How do we, as researchers, indigenous researchers, but also research ethics committees and members on research ethics review committees that identify as being indigenous people, how do they and we encourage the disruption of the uncritical adoption of these Euro-Western codes of conduct? What do we do to localize these codes if we do adopt them? In terms of the A, it refers to advocating for policy change. But if we want to advocate for policy change, do we engage on a national level also? And we have established a community of practice for research ethics and integrity under the auspices of SARIMA. And within that space, we are standing together, we are engaging in talking circles to make sure that ultimately we might have an influence also on a national level. And to that end, for instance, we requested whether a small group of this community of practice can be involved in the crafting of a new part to the Department of Health 2015 guidelines, focusing specifically on Indigenous knowledge and revising that section in the current guidelines. And then lastly, languaging as a lens of connection. And this is also linked to the work done by Prof Chalisa and also Prof Masoha and Shokane, where it's very clear that we need to speak the language of the people we engage with. And my suggestion would be for universities to start considering how research ethics terminology can be translated into Indigenous languages. I want to conclude by sharing with you that I was fortunate to attend the 7th World Conference on Research Integrity that recently took place in Cape Town, and also in the formulation of the Cape Town Statement. And the Cape Town Statement, you will see on the slide, I made reference to the background paper that is currently available on preprint server. So please feel free to engage in that document. But based on the work done by this community of practice, you will see that there was also an article published, Helicopter Research Comes Under Fire at Cape Town Conference, and in the International Journal of Science of 2 June 2022, journal authors and editors and reviewers, it states actually that these stakeholders will be encouraged to consider the Global Code of Conduct for Research in Resource-Poor Settings. But the focus for me is less on the fact that there is sensitivity that we must use more localized codes of conduct, but rather that there should be more transparency concerning ethics in our the articles and the work that we produce. And some of the key questions apparently that nature presents and that they will apply for researchers as well as for reviewers and editors include, for instance, is the research locally relevant, where legislation on animal welfare or environmental protection was less stringent in the local setting than where researchers were based? Was the study undertaken to the highest standards? And then they identify a new term for me. The term is citational justice. And they are asking whether researchers doing research within in the Southern African space, in the global South, do they actually cite researchers from the global South, or are we still trying to focus on international research and predominantly cite international researchers? This is a very interesting move away from the fact that it is important for us to publish in international journals, but even if we do that, to consider citational justice. My recommendations based on the ongoing work that I do is then based on the notion that I believe that we should not throw away the global or generic codes of conduct coming from the Euro-Western context, but that when we use these codes of conduct, we must domesticate it, and the domestication must go from critically reflecting on these codes of conduct within the context where the research will be done, but it should start actually also with ethics review committees considering their application forms and processes. Then capacity building initiatives are critical. and we also need to consider the restructuring of the research ethics curricula. We need to promote national advocacy and, for instance, through communities of practice to influence legislation and policy. And I am raising one last question. Is it not time for us to establish separate community engaged research ethics committees? I know that at UNISA we made a decision that research ethics applications, whether it's community engaged research or research that would not be classified as community engaged research, should all be reviewed by the same committee. But would we not be able to raise the bar if we are actually creating a separate community engaged research ethics committee? We make sure that the individuals serving the community is very well acquainted with Indigenous knowledge systems, community engaged practices, and also that that committee is actually established in such a way that it is well represented also by community members. And with that, I want to thank you. If you are interested in joining the community of practice for research ethics and integrity, please feel free to send Tanya Kutsie, who is in the audience today, an email. And then I want to thank you for the privilege to take part in this event.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fisafi. You have taken this to another level, you know, that we no longer ask questions, but we talk about how to practicalize all these ideas. Thank you so much. Again, I can't wait for the conversation that will be centered around this presentation. Professor Meyiwa, it looks like people really did get the brief. Your command to say they must center African knowledges has been presented. Now we want to hear from you. Before you come on board, Professor Meyiwa, I just want to introduce you properly as I have been introducing everyone else. Professor Meyiwa is the Vice Principal of Research, Postgraduate Studies, Innovation and Commercialization at UNISA. She has extensive research in higher education. Prior to her appointment at UNISA, she worked at various higher education institutions, including the Human Sciences Research Council, HSRC, as a senior manager and a researcher. She is a member of various parastatals, community and civil society organizations, such as the Rural Women's Movement, where she is the advisory board member, and the South African National Heraldry Council, where she serves as its chairperson. She has co-audited books and special issues of scholarly journals. I'm so sorry, Professor Meyiwa, I was very distracted by emails that are coming through, so I could not read your bio properly, but I hope people did get the important work that you do. Over to you, Prof. Meyiwa.
Thank you, Dr. Thenjiwe, for that. Let me just share what I've actually put up here. I think what I need to, how to put this on them. Okay, this is a bit of a challenge. It's not actually working in the manner that I planned it should. But that as it may be, let me just get on the task at hand. I should have, I'm trying to check, what am I doing wrong here with this? But that as it may be, I just apologize for this. That's my, I'm going to be showing the rest of the slides on the side. It's just only 9 slides, actually about 5 or so. It's just that I've spread them quite longer. That's the title of what I've given this brief 10 minutes talk, Disrupting Shameful Legacies. From the time that we had Prof Lisa talking about this to Prof Masoha and Dr. Fasafi, you can tell that we have these legacies that have gone over time that we need to really dismantle, disrupt. So what I'm trying to do in this 10 minutes is to look at how do we do this through not just only IKS, but as a feminist scholar, how does IKS principles meet the feminist research outlook from a point of view of the African side? So hence the outline of what I'm talking about is building on my understanding and the understandings of my mentees and colleagues that I work with for feminist research, what that means, and how we delineate these meanings and the characteristics that I've found as both a lover of indigenous ways of formulating knowledge and contributing to knowledge, but also as a feminist African scholar who believes in African feminisms, in the plurality, look at how we put this into context, how we rationalize it, and how we elaborate in terms of what does it then mean from an undertaking point of view, to which the two professors made reference to earlier, leading to Dr. Fasafi Reta saying, now how do we practicalize it? I want you to be looking at what I actually am concerned about, my thesis, but also in terms of how do I then do it with my students and mentees and colleagues that I work with. So as we know, at least from the research that we've done, the subject and practice of feminist research from an African point of view has been relatively neglected in most of standard research methods, books, as well as research ethics. Hence, my concern that we need to then be looking at how we do this in a particular sense that is putting the thesis and case in context. And in this particular instance, I want to be drawing from the Tsofimvaba a community within the Chris Hani municipality in the Eastern Cape, where I recently did my work there, at least for the past 10 years or so, but recently looking at this case study that I want to be using just briefly to look at in terms of how could we practically do this, and rather, at least from the point of view, what to do and not to do. These women of Tsofimvaba, they live in abject poverty. And always surprise me in the sense that they provide for their families in the manner that their counterparts fail to do so, despite them being in rural, deep villages. And this they do, learning from the work that they actually engage in, from caring from the elderly to the children to the household, to providing security, not just only food security, that they get to do. And this is something that therefore makes me think, what does this mean for the work? And puts a lot of questions when I do the work that I do. How do we conduct the kind of research that's feministic in its outlook, that's gender-based, but that's taken into account that who are we working with? This African man, this African woman, and the interpretation thereof become very important. And somehow relates to what we've had earlier on about the relational aspects, the rights that people have and the context in which they find. Hence, therefore, for me, it becomes very important to refer this to a sensitive textual way of engaging the people that we have referred to, just quoting Prof. Masoha earlier on. They are actually the holders of the research outputs that we have, the holders of the degrees that we ultimately get to have. And therefore, I present this morning these few do's we have to be recording and presenting some of the shared stories verbatim, taking into account that in reporting, we have to be doing that, which has been shared earlier on, as soon as possible, and do that just immediately after an event has happened. And also, as we do that, appreciate and recognize that the researched community, as it were, who are actually the library, the museum, the holders of this information, have life choices. They may not be giving us the information that we think we're looking for, and those life choices are often found in the behavioral patterns that are rooted in their heritage, rooted in their culture, rooted in their context, and rooted in the ways in which they do things. And in that way, it becomes therefore very significant that what we do in our research reports should be expressing the awareness of this heritage, and that we take into account that we must, for me, the context is women, allow women first and foremost to interpret their own stories. And therefore, in so doing, we need to further be doing, I've put this in kind of like a dozen do's, the to-dos, acknowledge the full identity, not only of them through their heritages and stories that they tell us and that we craft in the form of a variety of reports, dissertations, theses, papers, books, but then we also share our own and advance the information about who we are as researchers. The narratives that are not just only there to just extract information, to understand the environment, but what environment are we coming from? Therefore, in that way, we will be also getting to be equal somehow these museologists, because they are the research data holders. Hence, the special way of telling stories, when you dip yourself into the context, becomes a better way of directly experiencing the people who are involved in whatever they want to be talking about. In this instance, for instance, it was the stories that led to them getting to put up the projects and just ditching whatever that the government had come to talk to them about, because it was not speaking emotionally to their stories, emotionally to their lives, emotionally to how they want to be providing for their families. Hence, it becomes important that as researchers, as we mentor our mentees in the research processes, that we get them to have some checklist kind of that we put to them in terms of what should be done and how could we be doing that, taking cognizance of the identities of who people are, of how they want their knowledges to be expressed out there, but also equally taking cognizance of the fact that there are certain things we should not be doing, which is just want to put the two as a move towards the end in terms of we should not be interpreting the stories of the people we collect information from. We should not be coming to a final conclusion and a final publication before going back to them to say, when you were expressing this, sharing this information, is this what you meant? This is how I've crafted it, how I'm presenting it, and how I'm bringing you along as a co-author. Some of the work that I make reference to, we've co-authored with people who haven't been to schools at all, but have included them in as the co-authors. And in certain instances, part of the work I did in KZN, as even the first authors, because you got the information from them when you did the work with the Bambata Rebellion. In that way, we do not claim that we're providing information that's suggestive of the people from which we got the information, but in that way, taking into consideration, cognizant of being specific in what we're saying, and also in doing that, intentionally disrupt the legacies of how we've collected information how we interpret information, how we then present the data, and the fact that we include in our pathways of presenting the data, ensuring that owners, physiologists, the data producers become part of that. Program Director, I want to end by inviting colleagues who are part of this roundtable to the 30th of June. We're launching this book, which is part of the work that we've done. It is a work of 35 authors from across Africa, West, East, South, largely Southern Africa, where we were looking at the identities from the point of view of names. As a core editor here, we're saying names are fashioned by gender, and we've named this publication as Names Fashioned by Gender. There are stitched perceptions, contextual perceptions in there, and we are inviting you. We will be leaving that with whoever you will have communicated with when you got the invitation. Should you be interested on the 30th of June to actually participate in part of what, to a certain degree, I talked to about where we're introducing this kind of feminist onomastics from an African point of view, theorization of what we should be doing when we get out there. In that way, we will be addressing the key concern of this roundtable, that is, how is our research ethical patterning of what we do from the research point of view, taking cognizant of the people that we should be prioritizing as the owners of the information. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Meyiwa. Yeah, this, your comment was very clear, and you have really emphasized how we should make sure that we center the people that we conduct research on, and we humanize them. Thank you so much, Professor Meyiwa. I'm not going to waste a lot of time because I think we don't have enough time. When we started, I thought we had so much time. I'm realizing now that we might not have enough time. I've been looking at the conversation happening on the chats. We'll try and read some of the comments that have been coming through and the questions. But there is someone who raised her hand earlier. And sorry, Zoliswa Figele Pitwani, for saying you are Figide instead of Zoliswa. You raised your hand after Professor Masoha's presentation. I'm not sure if you still want to raise that question. We are opening up for discussion, so people who would want to raise questions can raise their hands, and we'll also try and read some of the comments and the questions that were posted on the chat. Zoliswa, do you still want to pose your question? Okay, while we are waiting for the hands and Zoliswa to come back to us, I will read one of the comments. The question or the comment, there is a comment from Dr. Klassen. Dr. Klassen wrote on the chat to say, Ubuntu and African culture is essentially rooted in collectivism. We have archetypical knowledge passed on to us by our elders. What is important is that this collective knowledge belongs to all of us. And when researchers collect our knowledges, there is a need to be that respect. Having said that, we need to ensure that collective knowledge does not mean participation in research studies. Okay, I'm not sure about this. Does not mean in participation in research studies, does not take away our individual autonomy. Meaning our traditional
participant is now joining.
Yeah, there is some communication there. Sorry about that. Meaning our traditional leaders decide on our behalf to participate in research or not. There's also something else. My primary discipline is molecular biology. Revealed it is not merely just about our indigenous knowledge. Science advanced to such an extent that scientists take our biodiversity, run tests on the compounds in plants, make reference, and based on the plant compounds, they know what medicinal value these compounds have. We need to tighten ethics review to address these issues. So that's the comment from Dr. Klassen from Namibia. I'm not sure if our presenter would like to respond from that comment, because I think it is talking about our knowledges, how we should value our knowledges and how we should approach our knowledges. Can our presenter?
Yes. Masoha.
Yes, Prof. Masoha.
I think there are 2 points that I would like to share here. And the first one is, and I think this is based on I'm sorry to take you back to one of the papers I did on a fish understanding its water. Whether you can have an American fish or you can have a British fish, because water is water. So knowledge is knowledge. I think that we should actually start from that premise of saying there is this global knowledge, but then in terms of how we appropriate and contextualize that based on our own worldviews and how we see things. But what has actually happened is that other communities have now used their own contextual views to impose them on others. And I'm happy that the person who posed this question is talking about microbiology. And it can still be done even in natural science, what we're talking about when you're looking at biology. But contextualizing and appropriating it in our context becomes very important. And I think this is very important even when you're looking at nursing, when you're looking at social work, whether you're looking at management, public management. So our contexts matter. And if we are to talk about the importance and internationalization of research without actually coming back home and starting at home, that creates a very serious problem, in my view. And we are actually doing that. Even when we supervise our students, we talk about what they should read and not read, and read, and what we consider to be important. And part of the problem is that we're not taking ourselves serious. We should start at home and actually deal with that from that point of view. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Prof. Masoha, for that. I see there is a hand. I can't. Can Tanya or Tando help me with the hands, because I can't see who has raised this hand.
I think Professor Fikelepi is back now. So
yes.
Let's do that one first, and then we can address. We can ask the question from Oyankuli.
Okay, Tanya, I did not get what the point you raised. Can you please repeat?
The lady that posed the question earlier, she's back. She's back. We can give her a chance, and then the person that raised his hand now, I'm not sure. I think it's male, Mr. or Dr. Oyankuli can then just maybe go next.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. Thank you for your assistance. In that order, and after your questions, there is another comment from the chat that I will read before I give back to our presenters. Over to you, Prof. Zoliso.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, colleagues. I'm really grateful to be in conversation with esteemed scholars that we have here today. And I'm particularly happy for the emphasis that both Professor Chilisa and my dean, Professor Masoha, have indicated on respect for the communities. And I would like to say that we infiltrate to go and conduct our research. And I'm particularly here focusing on the proposition that was made by Professor Masoha of representation of related communities in our research ethics committees. And I think this is very important for respectful ethical principles and accountability of researchers to the communities that we go and infiltrate as we conduct our research. This is I conducted research in a prison in here in South Africa, and I was exposed to a dual processing of both my doctoral proposal and later the findings from the research itself. And I call this dual processing because I had to do this with the research ethics committee of the university I was registered with, and also with the research unit of the Department of Correctional Services. So I ended up presenting the proposal twice, defending my findings 2 times. And I wondered then, and unfortunately I didn't do anything about it. I wondered how the dual processing could have been avoided, perhaps with some measures to integrate the process. And this is the reason now I'm happy that Professor Masoha is mentioning this today, because I do feel strongly that it really needs to be something to be considered by institutions. And this taught me, some important lessons in the strict separation of what we call the university, and the communities that we work with. And therefore, the interrogating the application of research ethics regarding our interaction with the communities that we serve. So I do believe that what Prof Masoha is proposing, is something that needs to be considered very seriously. And I'm saying this, my context being creative arts, which is about performance. And we deal a lot with what I call cultural bearers who are in the committees, in the communities, and we hardly, bring them into the universities, into the institution to work with us, and yet we're sucking a lot of knowledge from them. And what do they get in return? Why is it that we're not recognizing them, even at that level of application of research ethics? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Prof. The next person.
Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
Yes, thank you for allowing me to ask my question or make a comment. I don't know what the category it's going to fall into. I'm Oyekunle Akinpelu. I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the College of Human Sciences, Department of Philosophy. I just want to raise some observation and ask a question along the line as well to the panel discussants, especially regarding the issue of decolonization and indigenization of research. I made an observation sometimes in the academic discussion last year, and that one of the challenges that I observe with IKS is one that we often focus our energy much on deconstructing the colonial approaches or the foreign methods, and a few efforts is being put into reconstructing indigenous system to meet the current, the contemporary challenges that is facing Africa. There are other part of the world that are in need of these decolonial approaches as well, not Africa, but now I'm just using Africa for the purpose of my question. So my question now is, what approach, what method will be appropriate for a reconstructive stance? Because we all agree with me that not all indigenous ideas could pass as appropriate to deal with some issues. And that is another challenge we have with appropriating IKS, because we find scholars trying to present IKS as necessarily sacrosanct, that it is the idea of our forefathers, shouldn't be questioned. So if we want to start reconstructing ideas, for instance, I am out to meet the community and they bring, they tell me issues, they tell me what things are or how things should be. How do I reconstruct that to make, to fit into challenge of AI, challenge of technology, challenge of science and innovation? How do I reconstruct such ideas? And in the process of just reconstruction, how can I, at what point will I as a scholar now be saying, this is my idea now, not the idea of the community? And when I do that, am I not taking away the voice of the community from them? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Our presenters are going to respond. I think these two questions are not directed to any presenter, so you can all respond to these questions, comments. I would like, before I give this back to you presenters, to read one of the comments, which I think Professor Masoha did respond to, but for the benefit of this discussion, I think I would like to read it here so that other presenters can also respond to it. This is the comment from, I think, Professor Ndlovu. It says, the idea of ethics itself is value-laden and mediated by power. Its meaning is predetermined and not negotiated with communities. For example, we design consent forms by ourselves to ask research participants to give or refuse consent. Whether research participants agree or disagree, it is already not negotiation. So that's the comment that I think it will be interesting that our panelists respond to. And I think I just want to abuse my power a bit, because I also had a question. It is a question. From listening to every presenters, it seems to me that indigenous communities are somehow the only communities that can be researched. Coming from anthropology, we have this saying that we want to turn the gaze. My question is that, can we research other societies? Because I would want to believe that knowledge is everywhere. And if so, can we use what has been outlined here, what we have learned from indigenous communities? Can we use that to research other societies? So that is my question. I'm handing over. It is not directed to anyone. I think I'm also thinking out loud here. So I will hand over back to our panelist. Oh, okay, Dr. Fisachi, you have raised your hand, so you want to start with your responding.
I want to start with responding, and I do hope that I am actually going to address some of the concerns raised. I personally think that what is critical is that from a governance perspective, we must grow our competence to allow Indigenous researchers to really enter the field before they apply for research ethics approval, to engage with the communities, to discuss the knowledge sharing that will take place as part of that engagement, because there is a sense that when you apply for research ethics, you actually only engage with those communities after you obtain your ethics approval, and that doesn't work at all. That's why I argue, and I know that we have limited resources, but that's why I argue that
Unknown participant is now exiting.
Apologies, Rita. Just unmute yourself and continue.
Sorry, did I mute myself? Okay, I think it happened when the person left. So, Tanya, where was I?
About the communities, that we have to allow researchers to enter the community for prior informed.
Okay. Yes, so that is then why I argue that we must seriously consider whether there should not be separate, and probably I would argue for one centralized community engaged research ethics committee, and that committee then dealing with Indigenous-led research, and that committee then having a very sound understanding of the needs of that context, engaging with researchers and moving away from the myth that researchers should only enter the field after they've obtained ethics approval. Thank you, Madam Program Director.
Thank you, Dr. Fisagi.
Prof Meyiwa's hand was
okay. Thank you, Prof Masoha. Yes, Prof Meyiwa.
Thanks for that, Program Director. And just on the heels of what Dr. Fisagi has said, let me just try to respond from the questions. We've had 3 questions from Prof Ndlovu, Dr. Oyekunle, as well as Dr. Hadebe. This is adding on to what Dr. Fisagi has said. Dr. Ndlovu's concern is about consent and how we process consent. We need to begin to move away, I very much hold, as the practitioners of IKS, and in my instance as a feminist African scholar for African feminisms, we need to democratize, as I said in the welcome talk, our research processes and ethics by us ourselves as the primary investigators, putting into practice what we complain about. And we are very much although Prof Ndlovu makes reference to the dynamics of power, indeed, but us as supervisors, research chairs, committees of ethics, membership of those committees, as well as managers. What is it in our practices that we need to also be reflecting on? Often we talk about processes that are out there, and indeed the question that's being posed by actually the 3 colleagues very much reflects on and calls upon how we do the practice that we're preaching, but from a point of view of agency. What kind of agency, therefore, we need to begin to instill in our forms? Dr. Fisagi made reference to the form, so it is actually in our power not to be lamenting all the time, but check on what changes have we brought about or are bringing about towards ensuring that we practice all that we actually preaching. So the processes become important, not just only in the form of the data that we go out together, but even writing about and putting out there, recording, archiving, how we do things in a manner that speak to these theorizations and these kinds of scholarships that we want to to democratize, that we want to decipher, that we want to dismantle, that we want to bring about anew. To this end, I'm therefore thinking that Oyenkule's concern could somehow be addressed in that fashion by also acknowledging the fact that when we talk of IKS, one other challenge that I have is that we have theorists who just located in the time that is frozen, and of course not yielding the fact that you need to be looking at how we have evolved, and in that evolving process that we have, how are we not losing in the context of that, who we are? And therefore, what we're trying to do through this ASIKHULUME session is to check on how do we honestly reflect and regroup so that we're able to say what is not working well. Possibly we have to call it out. You know, I really like the question that is posed in Kule in terms of saying we seem to be romanticizing all that's in the IKS, but possibly I also as an IKS a scholar, practitioner, although that may be arguable, but one needs to be checking on what it is that we're doing to think outside of the box, which somehow does refer to and respond in what I'm suggesting to Dr. Khadebe's concern in terms of what about other societies? Are other societies not having indigenous ways of knowing and of living, of behaving? Indigeneity is not necessarily African. It actually applies across societies of the world. And what it is that we're looking at in terms of studying those as well comparatively, if we will, or in an opposition manner, and learning from that. Hence, what we've also spoken about in terms of even in these knowledges, what have we learned from other forms of knowing that we want to or have consciously or not brought into our practices? And in that way, I'm thinking that we have started that conversation. We need to escalate it in terms of how we are able to put it into practice. I'm sorry, my device that I'm using does not seem to be acknowledging the comments. So I may have missed actually all comments. I can't read them. It's just so blurry. Apologies for that, Program Director. Thank you.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Prof Meyiwa. I saw Prof Masoha's hand is up, and Professor Chilisa's hand is also up. Yeah. There is another hand from Mutewo, but let us allow the presenter the presenters to respond, and then we'll take Mutewo.
I'll be very brief, and I agree with the earlier comments made by colleagues. I think the first issue is that it's, Professor Ndlovu uses this expression that we are all wounded, and we come from a history of woundedness, and here we're not just trying to deconstruct the colonial approach at all, but I think it's in that sense of woundedness as you relate and reflect on that woundedness. And this woundedness, I take it that Professor Ndlovu also relates to our knowledge paradigms, our knowledge systems, which are very critical, and they've been affected in the process, as we are people. And I think we're all trying to deal with that. That's the first question. And I think this forum it's actually a reconstruction of that. And it's an attempt to say, there is something worth considering, and let's do something about it. And that is actually a move from deconstructing the colonial paradigm or approach. And thirdly, it is up to us if we are very serious about this whole agenda or business in terms of what students read, what we prescribe for our students. It starts there. It also talks to the attitude that we have as supervisors and researchers. Because one thing that I experienced, and I'm glad that Ayo is from philosophy. I recall many years ago when I went to the University of St. Augustine in Johannesburg, I was ridiculed by philosophers for talking about IKS. And now, very interesting now, philosophers are now talking about, they are battling with this question about Africanizing, or do we have African philosophy, or paradigms of Africa in philosophy, something like that. That's something that I've been talking about. But that is actually the current debate now. And it's interesting that at that time, I'm talking about African scholars who were so interested in these Western paradigms and ridiculing another African, saying it doesn't make sense what you're talking about because it doesn't actually make it in terms of the structure of thinking. You need to be talking about Assad and all these other philosophers in the process. And I think it's us who are making it difficult for ourselves. So, and coming back to the question now raised by Ayo closely, one of the things that we need to do, and we've now started working on methodology, and that paradigm needs to be addressed very seriously. And I think it also talks to the teaching and learning in terms of how we are going to address the teaching and learning issues and so on. And we also have got to change our ontological frames. And we also have got to look at what we mean by innovation from the perspective of our point of view. Because one thing we like to talk about excellence. We like to talk about quality, and from whose point of view. These are some of the concepts that we are so consumed by. We like them. And we like internationalizing things. We don't even know what is international means, because if it's international, it means going to America and also reading an article in America. And I think we need to sit down and come to a point where we are saying these are the things that really, really matter for us, and engage with them. And I don't agree. And I hear what Ayo is saying. And I think I would even say that if you read an article done by Agraval, who talks about indigenous knowledge systems and the process of scientization, it really, really, really moves away from the reconstruction point of view. But then it talks about now, how do we then rebuild, reconceptualize, not forgetting that we are wounded, and that history of woundedness also deals with our knowledge systems in this regard. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Masoha. Professor Chilisa?
Thank you, Chair. I'll comment on the question of whether IK approaches are applicable to other societies. And I'll start off by saying that we all have to recognize that knowledge is political, is cultural, is historical. And if we take Kuni's assertion, at every point in time, people question, and there's a big commotion, people questioning, and as they question, something happens, which is a revolution. And with that revolution comes a new paradigm. And that new paradigm is just but another of the many paradigms that have occurred over time. So my thinking is that right now we have a decolonization wave that is sweeping across all the corners of the globe, and that Africa is part of that global agitation and questioning of how research is done and the ethics of research. So what is happening? What is happening is that we are all moving towards coming to the birth of a new paradigm, which some people may call an indigenous paradigm. And this paradigm is a paradigm that has various cultural paradigms. And when we say cultural paradigms, we are actually emphasizing the fact that when you look at Africa, of course, it's very diverse, and that from Africa, there may be many worldviews that inform how we can look at ethics, but that generally we are going to have some common principles that will inform how an ethical research is done in societies that have been wounded, in societies that have suffered colonization and imperialism. So from that perspective, what we are working, I think what scholars are working on, what we are working on in Africa is joining the others in New Zealand, in Australia, in the United States of America, those that have been excluded from the communication on how to do research in such a way that it is inclusive and respectful of knowledge system. We are at that point where we are all doing all we can to bring in what will in the end become the basic principles of doing research to accommodate other knowledge systems. And we are bringing into the Western way of doing research, we are bringing in that which has been excluded. And amongst those that which has been excluded, of course, is spirituality and ecological justice. We know now that climate change is a big problem, and we know that the world is turning to indigenous communities or indigenous knowledge of those that have been colonized, and those that talk about the connection between people and the environment. We know that they are now turning to us to say, okay, so this ecological justice, how do we bring in to be part of the research ethics that should inform how we do research, be it in England or wherever? That becomes a principle. And I am very proud to say that that principle comes from our IKS. So to say that, please, let's not look at IKS as just that knowledge that is kept in Africa and is only applicable to indigenous people, but as science that has been excluded and that has to be included globally. And our challenge now is how to package it into principles that all can apply. And I was very happy to hear about all that is happening to the extent that we even think of citation and citation and citation justice. So we are invited African scholars to participate in this revolution that is taking place, and if we do it well, we'll be counted. Right now, Ubuntu is counted as one of those philosophies that can even inform the West how they can relate with others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chilisa. You know, I'm looking at our time. It's 2 minutes after 11, and we had a hand from Mutewo. Can I ask everyone that we allow Mutewo, because I'm not sure whether it's a he or she, they raised their hands a long time ago, so that we don't suppress anyone. But that will be our last hand. Yes, Mutewo. Mutewo.
Much and everyone that side, Prof Masoha and Professor Chilisa and other esteemed speakers. I think the topic that we are discussing, colleagues, is a very important topic, and it's very close also to my heart. As someone who has been doing research in indigenous knowledge systems for almost the past 20 years, I agree with so many things that have been spoken by the past speakers, but also I also have a very interesting thing. Maybe let me start from a legislative and also from a policy framework point of view. Like, as we know, colleagues, that in this country, South Africa, we do have a law of indigenous knowledge, which is the IK Act, and we have to be proud about those developments. It might not be a perfect law, but it's something which is a milestone, which in this country we have to be very proud of. And going now to institutions of higher learning, as we know, colleagues, talking about indigenous knowledge systems in our institutions of higher learning, it's like promoting witchcraft and also doing research in local communities, as we've been talking about ethics, how we do research. My main interest is on who are the researchers, who are the people who are doing research in these local communities. I'm interested in the issue of us developing a cadre of these indigenous researchers and scientists who will be the ones who will be able to implement the things that we are talking about. And it's going to be very difficult for our institutions of higher learning because this is part of transformation. Because as we talk about indigenous knowledge systems in our universities, I think it will be prudent for us to have what we call institutional IKS policy. So all these issues of research and other issues will have to be encompassed around the policy framework that we have to develop in institutions of higher, because everybody right now in our universities, they're doing research in IKS, but it's from a compartmentalized point of view and also from an uncoordinated focus. That is why whatever that we are trying to do in IKS, it always faces challenges because we don't have frameworks in our university. Our universities have got their own agendas and strategies. So we have to be able to have our own legislative framework so that we can be able to argue IKS, and even our universities should not only be able to just be a place when we talk about IKS, we only talk of indigenous knowledge holders when we only want to involve them in our research. But we have to create spaces for these indigenous knowledge holders in our own institutions so that they can be part and parcel of what we're, so they can develop the research agendas with students, and they can also be part of the supervisors of students, because even the knowledge holders themselves, they are researchers. It's not only the students and the researchers who come, they must be part and parcel of this research agenda, so that this research should also have a sense of ownership and should also be a sense of collective, some kind of appreciative. So those are my points, colleagues. I want to say that it's very, very important to build these new cadres of indigenous researchers who will be able to implement these policies and frameworks that we are trying to develop in research in IKS. Thank you very much, colleagues, for the time. But I would like to applaud the organizers of this event, that it's a forum that is very important to take forward even in other institutions and to include others who are interested in this topic. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Mutewo. In the interest of time, I'll just ask Professor Meyiwa and Professor Masoha to quickly respond to Mutewo.
I'm not sure in terms of the seniority. Probably I should go first, and Professor Meyiwa will close.
Oh, okay. Thanks for correcting me, Prof. Masoha. Yes.
No, I completely agree with what Dr. Koitsu is saying. And there was a time when universities were developing their own institutional IKS policies. I'm talking about South Africa in this case, and I think what Mutewo is saying, I think, makes sense. Just to even indicate that, I mean, Mutewo is quite right. I mean, he has been in this field. He started there as a young person, and over 20 years or so, he has been in this field, and I think he knows that. And his PhD is on the indigenous astronomy, working with communities in terms of reading stars and stuff. Like, he went to Botswana. He's been to some communities here in South Africa. So I think we should actually start there. And I think this should basically mean that we need to go to universities, so to institutes like the NRF. We go to the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. We go to HSRC, CSIR. I think we need to come back. And I think this takes us back to when when the IKS Champions story started way back in 2000, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it was 1996, if I'm not mistaken, which was led by then Professor Serute, who was the chairperson of the portfolio committee then, because it was still the DAX, it used to be Department of Arts and Culture, Science and Technology, one department. So that's how it started, the whole story. And this was started with the Hoodia. But institutions were just coming in, and students were invited to participate, and then collecting data and so on. But now we have legal frameworks that are in place. But it's time that universities must now also show that they've got frames in place, processes in place, governance in place, so that we deal with this matter. And I agree with it completely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Masoha. Professor Meyiwa.
Wow. Just a brief on this. Thanks, Prof. Masoha and Dr. Mter for introducing this last, as we wrap up, endorsement of what the discussion is meant to be, and it is actually about. My sense is that we need to go beyond the taken for granted all that we know, and really do claim back, raise the voice, and that being done within our spaces, because we have the power to do that, thereby ensuring that as the Constitution firmly entrenches the principle of dignity and recognition of cultural and traditional norms and practices and knowledges, it's therefore becoming something that we may, when the time comes, possible revise, at least within the South African context, much more in terms of what we should be doing in that fashion. So with that said, the indigenous, indeed, from the last two speakers, does express the fact and succinctly captures the impact of the historical context of colonization and a lot of obliteration, what we've lost in the process, and how then do we ensure that in recouping the losses, we do so by acknowledging a variety of knowledge makers in the contribution of what we want to make. We know that knowledge is something that, if you look at some countries who don't have anything that's related to what we have from the mineral resources point of view, that becomes their way of sustaining themselves. And I'm just wondering, at what point are we going to be, as made reference to by Prof. Chilisa earlier on, finding solutions through these knowledges that we have to respond better to the challenges of the present day. So I'm just thinking that, as my colleagues have also said, the fellow panelists, that we are really on the path of regrouping afresh and reinventing and recalibrating the IK various forms of what we should and could do towards being a better society on the African continent, but also broadly. Thanks, Program Director.
Thank you so much, Professor Meyiwa. We are really out of time, and I think we just really do need to close. But I would like to make some few closing remarks, just to thank everyone who have participated here. This has been the best session I've ever attended. Thank you so much to our panelists for such an informative and insights. I cannot even attempt to summarize the deliberations we have just had. Remaining true to Professor Meyiwa's command, the conversations indeed centered Africa. More than that, presenters showed us how African knowledges are central in research ethics, that the approaches we use should take cognizance of the fact that Africans have their own ways of making sense of the world that is derived from their worldview. These are the Afro-sensed perspective. The Afro-sensed perspective are critical when conducting research in Africa instead of using foreign ideologies to understand an African experience. This is important because African knowledges transcend the physical world and are inclusive of the metaphysical as well. Taking these knowledges seriously can assist in research ethics. That can assist in research ethics requires us to develop frameworks to ensure that we don't slip back to approaches that took our humanity away as Africans. Professor Chilisa, Professor Masoha, Professor Meyiwa, and Dr. Fisage, thank you so much for being generous and share these insights with us. Words can never be sufficient to express our gratitude. Thank you. I would also like to thank the organizing team who ensured that this event is a success. I'm not going to mention you by names. I know you worked tirelessly. You know, Tando would send emails in the middle of the night. Of course, she was not working alone. It was a team. So thank you so much for your hard work. Lastly, but definitely not least, I would like to thank everyone who managed to join and participate in the discussion. Without you, this event would not have been a success. I know that there are people from other universities. Thank you so much for the support. Please invite us when you have similar events because we are a community. I would like to thank everyone for taking their time to attend this event. I know that everyone has a very busy schedule, but you chose us. We really appreciate this. Siyabonga kakhulu.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.